By now you should realize that we really do value a diversity of opinions, and we're going to get to some of those issues in the closing. Ms. Attkisson is a 5-time Emmy award-winning recipient and the recipient of the Edward R. Murrow Award for Investigative Reporting. She is the author of 2 New York Times bestsellers, The Smear, How Shady Political Operatives and Fake News Control What You See, What You Think, and How You Vote, and the book Stonewall. She is the host of a Sunday morning national TV news program, Sinclair's Full Measure, which focuses on investigative and accountability reporting. For 30 years, Ms. Attkisson was a correspondent and anchor at CBS News, PBS, CNN, and in local news. I think it's fair to say that her investigative reporting has infuriated both Democrats and Republicans, which probably means she's got a good measure of the truth in her reporting. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Sharryl Attkisson.
Thank you.
So the format for this panel will be a moderated interview, but you guys did such a great job with the last panel. I think I'm going to turn it over to you all quicker than I did last time. So let me ask you a few questions, Sharryl, to start off, and we'll get some views interspersed here. Why investigative journalism?
Well, I didn't set out to do investigative journalism. I was just a regular reporter, but I found that, I won't say most reporters are lazy, because maybe that's not true, but a lot of reporters are lazy in terms of going the extra mile. They go home at the end of the day after you've done your story and your job's done. But I usually had unanswered questions on the most basic stories that I would spend more time trying to figure out the answer to. And I often found in local news, if you follow the money, say the mayor makes a decision that defies logic, and maybe it's a one-day news story that someone got hired to do a particular job for too much money, if you keep digging, you find out things like, that's his wife's brother-in-law, or you can make connections, and there's usually a financial connection behind almost anything that I end up covering or I end up seeing as important. So just by asking the extra questions, it kind of makes you an investigative reporter because you're going the extra mile.
Great. Well, you've had a distinguished career as an investigative reporter, and over the last 10 years, you've had some significant stories that have appeared all over the news. Which of those stories have you found the hardest to dig into and tell the truth about?
Well, I would say as a result of the industry that I'm here to talk about partly today, I call it the smear industry. As a result of this large group of operatives and organizations that manipulate narratives on the news and social media behind the scenes using artificial accounts, fake names, political operatives, corporate operatives, they've made it harder to tell the truth in general. So it's not the stories that necessarily became harder, it's the forces fighting these stories, keeping them off the air, censoring them, became more effective. So I would say the last couple of years, as I covered Benghazi, as I covered the Fast and Furious story, which was when the government got caught, believe it or not, transporting or allowing the transport of thousands of weapons to Mexican drug cartels. These things became harder to tell after the initial stories because of this smear industry that exists and operates underneath the radar to stop reporters like me and to stop my colleagues at the New York Times. You know, this has been a topic of discussion for years, which is why I thought it would make a great book. The gentleman sitting over here in the last panel did a good job, but I think he was a little bit modest because he is actually at the tip of the spear of the biggest, best-known smear organization in Washington, D.C., which is the subject of several chapters in the book. And I thought it might be interesting, you probably can't see, but I made a chart of that group. Media Matters is on here. It's run by a political operative named David Brock, and he started all of these groups. Media Matters, I won't read all of them, but Media Matters Action Network, Equality Matters, Franklin Forum, Franklin Education, Bridge Project, American Bridge Foundation, Correct the Record. There's so many. They operate, groups like this one, using different names, nonprofits, charities, LLCs, political action committees. They hire global law firms. They work on behalf of billionaire donors who remain nameless, all to influence the narratives you see on the news today and what you see on social media. And they've just become super effective at tactics that they use to shape opinion on behalf of those they're trying to shape it for.
So this word collusion is bantied about recently in the news. In this, excuse me, in Smear, you talk about several instances where news organizations, sounds like collusion to me, may have provided information to campaigns ahead of time to help shape the opinion. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, both Democrats, Republicans, and corporations, I think, equally seek to be able to influence the news. But I would argue, and both Republicans and Democrats I interviewed for the book argue, the best at it in the last election cycle were the progressives or the liberals or the Democrats at shaping opinions and using their organizations and spending more money to shape the narrative. So there are many ways in which they do this during the campaign. It was fundraising and through political action committees and so on. But as I said, you look around on the news every day and you may not realize the terms used, whether it's collusion or fake news. Those are created terms that are put on the plate for you to use and to advance a particular narrative. I always say on a given night, there are thousands of news stories that could make the national news, literally, thousands of them that would be legitimate. Why do you think so many news organizations pick the same 2, 3, or 4 of them, often using the same phrases and terms, even though we're all independent journalists, and often interviewing the same people from some of the same groups using the same talking points? That's a result of the successful manipulation of the media landscape that exists as a result of these groups that I talk about. And if we want to, we can talk a little bit about the origin of the term fake news, not just fake news as was discussed on the last panel, which was a good discussion, but why it became a topic in fall of 2016. I dug into that into this book. Book as well.
Let's go there. In your book, you talk about 3 terms. Narratives. So narratives, some might interpret, well, that's just the theme. You talk about Astroturf, and then you talk about fake news. So can you define those and how they influence the 2016?
Narrative is commonly used by the operators in the business that try to make you think on point. They try to direct a narrative. They try to make it where the topic of conversation on the news is about a certain topic and not about another topic. So sometimes their goal is to further one opinion or viewpoint, but often their goal is to keep another one from being heard, and both are equally as important and effective by these groups. Astroturf, and I wrote about that a lot in my first book, there's some of it in here, is simply the term for fake grassroots, meaning when you see things on social media, a movement starting perhaps, or something, a hashtag that's gaining your attention, being seen a lot of times you're supposed to think these were organic in nature, that people you don't know, but genuine, ordinary Americans started this movement, when in fact, I would argue most of the time, these things are planted and started by the industry of smear groups and operators that I'm talking about. One of them that I interviewed for the book said, you can start a whole movement. In fact, this was a military official who's in this business, by the way, former military official. He said, you can start a whole movement on Twitter in 140 characters and a few fake Twitter accounts, which is done commonly. They look like real accounts. They're attached to real people. Social media accounts, as you may know, can be maintained by special software that the government uses and corporation uses that can maintain fake identities of actors that look real, that connect to real people, that connect to people you know, because the operators in this universe know that you're most likely to be influenced on politics or anything else by people in your social network that you know or you think you know or your friends and family know, so they exploit that to try to shape these narratives and manipulate opinion. Fake news, as the last panel said, there's no official definition police that gets to decide what that means. Both sides are trying to define it, and I think they were right in saying each side uses it to define the news they don't like on the other side. But what I found most interesting is fake news went from a phrase that was pretty much never used, from what I could tell, until to the point it was used every day all of a sudden in fall of 2016. So studying these this industry the way I do, I knew or believed this was the rollout of a propaganda campaign. Who, I wondered, wants us to start talking about fake news explicitly and why? Follow the money, where does this originate? I looked back and found that a group called a nonprofit, and nonprofits are often fronts for political and corporate interests, but they look charitable, or they're made to look charitable. Very little oversight in the federal government of them. A group called First Draft really coined this movement to curate our news. And at the time, this was strange to me because before this discussion, there was no grassroots effort. The American public wasn't saying, please somebody curate our news. Please somebody filter through and keep some of the news off of our plate and put some of it on our plate. But suddenly we were made to believe there was a big need for such a thing. So within a couple of weeks of this nonprofit First Draft coming up with this idea and partnering with primarily, actually entirely left-wing news organizations and fact-checking organizations, which was another tip to me, President Obama made a speech at Carnegie Mellon where he said we needed to curate the wild, wild west of information on the internet. And I remember thinking at the time, no one was calling for that. Why do we need to curate the news? My theory came to be, since this was coming from the left, they have been very effective at largely controlling the news media and getting their talking points furthered and getting their people hired in the news media. They've been largely effective at controlling the political discussion. The last thing that they were not able to control well was the internet, the social media, as the last panel said, where people can find things there that they can't find elsewhere. And I believe there's an effort to try to stop this last bit of uncontrolled information from being out there for everybody to find. So within a short period of time after President Obama said we had to stop fake news, as if the news media got their assignment, every day in the headlines there were stories about fake news. I mean, it was, it was as we reporters were not thinking critically, even though there was perhaps an element of supposedly fake news that could be addressed. It seemed to me that very few people were saying, who's wanting us to discuss this? Why are they putting this on our plate? So I'll just fast forward to me calling First Draft to follow the money, to see who is behind this nonprofit. They hadn't filed any tax papers that would indicate where their money comes from. And First Draft told me that they were funded from Google. And if you follow the money trail on Google, their parent company, Alphabet, is run by a man who was Hillary Clinton's top donor, #1 or #2 donor, and is very politically active for political interests. And First Draft was started with money from Alphabet/Eric Schmidt at the beginning of the 2016 election cycle and came up with a fake news concept, which was the liberals' idea of cracking down on, I think, news they didn't like, some of it indeed fake. Then along came Donald Trump, the wild card, as I say in the book. I think most Republicans, if this effort had been launched at them, it would have been very successful. But Donald Trump, as the last panel said, master marketer, master brander, he just sort of circled it back and started calling the news he didn't like or the mistakes the mainstream media was making fake news. Pretty soon, he did it so often, it drove them nuts. And last I heard, they were starting to say, let's quit talking about fake news. Why is everybody using that term? And a lot of my friends actually think Donald Trump came up with the idea of fake news, and I have to tell them that was a liberal initiative that was really taken over by conservative interests or by Donald Trump interests because he's a master brander. But that's the story of fake news. I don't just look at what's being discussed in the media. I always know when there's a common theme, there's somebody behind it and usually a money interest.
Yeah, so that's a great point, and we sort of touched on this a little bit in the last panel. So as a consumer, it's pretty hard to figure out these days where to go to get what we might term accurate and reliable information, because there's narratives in this. So how would you recommend we go about looking at internet sources especially and be able to find accurate news?
I get asked, that's probably one of my most often asked questions. I don't have a great answer because we're at a place right now where if you're like me, anything I see on the news, it's not that I assume it's false, but I do not assume it's true. And it doesn't matter if it's from the New York Times, the Washington Post, CBS, NBC, ABC, some of the biggest, most well-respected formerly news organizations have made some of the biggest mistakes in the past 2 years, making it impossible to know whether you can trust what they're saying, no matter how many sources they have, and no matter how many news outlets are reporting them. Actually, quite the opposite. Sometimes when I see a narrative overwhelmingly overtaking all the news, I tend to trust that less instead of more. And until I can get more information, I take that information with a grain of salt. More information means, and who has time to do this? This is what reporters are supposed to do for you. More information means I watch the original news conference myself to see if the excerpt that they've used was out of context. I often find it is, in my opinion. I have a whole different takeaway. I may go to C-SPAN and watch a whole hearing myself to see if the little piece of the hearing that was reported is actually the whole story. So I can only tell you that if you find a reporter that strikes you as knowledgeable and honest on a particular topic you know something about, that may be your go-to reporter on that topic. Not a whole news organization, but you may pick reporters at different organizations on different topics. But I can't say there is a single news organization that I would recommend you read from cover to cover, which no one does anymore, and just believe everything that they say in there. We're not at that point.
So has journalism really moved from sort of the Walter Cronkite days? Walter Cronkite, one of the most respected journalists in the country, at least through 1960s and early 70s, where he presented what we perceived as fairly objective reporting. Has it moved from that to news organizations largely being advocacy groups?
Yes. I think if you're a fairly young person today, this is all they're really going to know. But in my time, the news was by and large fairly disconnected from opinion. In fact, when I worked at CNN back in 1990, it was forbidden. It didn't even have to be discussed. We didn't give our opinions. We tried to, even when we were covering international news about dictators, we tried to cover things fairly, even the dictator's viewpoint fairly, so that we were giving a total picture with absent as much bias as possible, trying to see other viewpoints and other sides. This environment is totally different, especially the last 2 years, whereas reporters are now being invited to mix their opinion within the news, which was never supposed to be, at least when I went to journalism school, that was just not, that was the opposite of hard news journalism. You were to keep your opinions out. Now, reporters are being invited to put their opinions in. Part of this is, as I discussed in the book, political operatives like those trained through organizations like Media Matters, they literally train journalists to report the one side of an issue that they believe in, that they're funded to report on. They place these journalists in stories. They pay news outlets that you know of online or quasi-news outlets to publish these stories. They often don't disclose who's behind them. These journalists are hired at news organizations like mine. Partisans, corporate operatives, political operatives are hired, and they're allowed to present on the news now without the disclosure of who their financial interests are, without the disclosure, which is, in my view, is unethical, of where they came from. And one of the last things I argued before I left CBS News, partly because of some of these trends I saw, they hired a political operative, which I had no problem with the hiring, but I said, when he presents an opinion on CBS News, you have to say he is currently working for a Hillary Clinton PR firm, a PR firm funded by Hillary Clinton loyalists going into the election. This was the former #2 at the CIA. I said, he may have good opinions on things you want to consult him about, but you must disclose ethically, in journalism terms, who he's being paid by. CBS didn't agree. And I think that's the change we've had in our industry, that we're not disclosing these things. Now, journalists and opinion makers are one and the same, and there's no firewall, and we're not disclosing to viewers where that line is.
So you use several emails as evidence to talk about reporters actually going to the various campaigns and actually supplying questions, whether it was about an upcoming piece that they were going to write, or maybe debate questions comes to mind to a candidate beforehand. which seems to be contrary to what you're talking about, Sharryl.
It is. I mean, in traditional journalism, you don't share results of a story with one side of the story. You don't okay your publication. You don't okay your facts. You don't make agreements behind the scenes of what you're going to say. That reminds me. So I published a story in The Hill today that quoted briefly from a couple of these, I think, emails that you're talking about. Well, this one probably wasn't in the book, but this is an example of how government officials, both Democrats and Republicans, and corporations work behind the scenes to manipulate the media, and often successfully. In October of 2011, the Department of Justice was roiling in controversy over the multi-layered cover-up of Operation Fast and Furious, where federal agents secretly allowed trafficking of weapons to Mexican drug cartels. This is an email. Where are our surrogates? Then Attorney General Eric Holder asks his top press aide, Tracy Schmaler, in an email. By surrogates, he means, where are all the people that are going to go out in the news and defend us on our behalf? We need to get them on the news. Gave our stuff to some of the regular Democrat pundits and bloggers on cable, replies Schmaler. Lanny Davis, a friend of Hillary Clinton's, was on O'Reilly this week and pushed back and talked with him at length last night, gave him our stuff, reaching out to others. In another email, an advisor to Eric Holder, the former attorney general who wanted to deflect this controversy, an advisor tells Eric Holder, find a way for you to get in front of a reporter or two about this. You could find a way to run into a couple of reporters on your way to something. Maybe Pete Williams, Kerry, Pete Yost, all reporters. That part can be managed. Most important is that you get in front of a camera in a relaxed manner, giving a response you have rehearsed. So they're using us, using us to put out our propaganda when they're talking like that, and we're letting them. Last one, an email in May of 2015 showed the Hillary campaign was furious that NBC supposedly violated an agreement dictating how a story was to be written in exchange for getting an interview with former President Clinton. These deals are never supposed to be made, in my opinion. So here's the staff of Clinton's campaign complaining about the NBC interview because they didn't go along. Going in, NBC agreed to do 70% of the piece on the good work of the Clinton Foundation and 30% about the book, the controversy at hand, a negative book being written about Clinton. Cynthia McFadden was the interviewer, and she didn't ask one question about the foundation, not one. Absurdly, NBC is still promising they will stick by the 70%, 30% agreement by using footage of the events and Cynthia describing the work of the foundation. Not sure if it will help, but I called Chuck Todd, head of the NBC political unit, to let him know how outrageous and ludicrous this was, that our side is watching to see how NBC handles this. I think we have to make this public. My point being, that's the kind of pushback. When you do a story, if they don't like it, they pull strings. They call your boss. They call your corporate head. They threaten to withhold access for future interviews you may want. There's all this behind-the-scenes manipulation. But a 70%, 30% agreement, we'll do a story that's 70% positive on you on this topic and 30% will ask about the negative one. That's kind of stuff is never supposed to be done, and it's so common now.
So Sharryl, the last panel talked a little bit about some changes brought about by social media, especially the Twitter sphere. So are you on Twitter, and how do you use that as a tool to get at telling truth?
I got on Twitter. CBS made us a few years ago as a promotional tool to promote our stories, and it's very effective. I mean, things really do get around on Twitter, and I use it as a news gathering tool. I will see hints of news stories about to come sooner on Twitter than anywhere else. You see them oftentimes first as rumors, which means you don't necessarily believe them, but you have a heads up that something's about to happen. To get at the truth, I think I simply use it more as a survey of a huge landscape. The people I follow and the news outlets I follow provide me on Twitter just a good mix of liberal, conservative, in the middle, nonpartisan stories that I feel like at a glance I can kind of get on there and see a wide variety of what's happening. Getting at the truth, maybe I will see a conservative publication come up with a story and a headline, but then I will also see the liberal version of it, and that gives you sort of an idea of what may really be going on, because so often you don't see what's in between or what's two-sided. you see one or the other.
Yeah. So the danger is lack of context.
Right.
140 characters is pretty short.
Right.
If we could all write a
Yes.
great thesis statement with 140,
Indeed.
we would be great. So I have one last question. I'm going to open it up to the audience to ask your questions under the same rules as last panel. You write a little bit about your first book in Stonewall, that there's actually a connection also between corporations and their attempts to influence policy through some of these various nonprofits that are disguised. Does that distort and help contribute to this?
It does.
Noxious environment.
Corporations and politicians have learned that nonprofits, these charitable groups that are tax exempt, they have very little oversight by the federal government, and they're a wonderful way to advance some sort of cause, almost like laundering the true money behind it. For example, well, the joke inside my business is that if you see a nonprofit that says one thing, it's usually the opposite. So the group for the tobacco-free workplace is probably R.J. Reynolds, the tobacco company. I'm making up the example, but you can almost assume whoever's behind it is the opposite of what they say. I learned that one group that was trying to stop my stories on medical risks of vaccination turned out to be every child by 2. Sounds very innocent, but their behavior was strange. They should have wanted safety, to look at safety first, so it was counterintuitive that they didn't want stories about safety. And when I looked at their IRS papers and dug through them, it did show that a vaccine maker had started this nonprofit. So I have rarely found a nonprofit that doesn't have some sort of influence behind it like this. One funny one is CBS one year said, oh, there's a great poll coming out tomorrow on America has an epidemic of sleeplessness. We're all like having a really problem. There's a new study that shows this tomorrow by the National Sleep Foundation. Can you do that story? Knowing what I do, I said, yeah, I'll do the story, but I assumed there was some sort of interest behind the National Sleep Foundation. Nothing wrong with that, but we have to disclose it so viewers can make up their mind how to weight the information we're giving them. And it was pretty easy to find out the National Sleep Foundation is a nonprofit funded by sleeping pill makers. And they were just about to launch a new sleeping pill called Lunesta. And this was part of the advanced rollout of Lunesta, which they do in medical journals. They ghostwrite medical articles to try to get your doctor to start looking at, gosh, everybody's so sleepy, I need to start asking my patients about sleeplessness. And then along comes Lunesta, and the doctors are like, oh, there's a solution to this. This is all manipulated. So I told CBS the next day, I'm happy to cover this story, but I will disclose in the story that this is an effort of people trying to drum up business. And I also wondered, you know, their big line was, we have an epidemic of sleeplessness, but don't even know it. And I'm like, is it really an epidemic if we don't know it? If we're sleeping, we don't know it? So I did the story the next day, and it eventually got written up in the Columbia Journalism Review as an example of, all the media did the story. It's just so interesting. But I was the only one that disclosed that the interest behind the supposed poll, which was actually just a survey, were the makers that would benefit from us convincing us that we're all sleepy. So there's a lot of that.
Great. I'd like to open it up to our audience. If you have questions, please come to the microphone and address Ms. Attkisson.
Good afternoon, Cadet Kundayo, Virginia Military Institute. I was wondering how you would propose we combat smear organizations besides just having investigative journalism, and also, do you think that the state of news right now, do you think it's just the way news is, the new ecosystem, or do you think it's a state and something we can move from?
I think we're evolving, and I don't know where we're going to end up. And some of my colleagues think the pendulum has swung one direction, like we're too now controlled by opinion and political and corporate interests, and that it will swing back another way. I hope that's true. I hope we're just not over here to stay. I'm not sure about that. Combating smear organizations, I think, calling them out for what they do, Media Matters, the gentleman that was here, they used to see me as a friend because they thought I was liberal when I was reporting on the Bush administration. Then when they saw me reporting the Obama administration, they have launched very high-profile attacks against me. well-funded, orchestrated, organized, the meanest kind of stuff. When you see people going after, as I say, a reporter personally, when this becomes personal, they're not arguing the facts as much as trying to controversialize a story. A reporter, a whistleblower, a particular politician, when they're personalizing it like that, it's usually part of a smear campaign. It doesn't mean everything they're saying is untrue. Some of it may be true, some of it may be not. But they're trying to ball it up in something that becomes bigger to destroy the person's reporting, to destroy the story, to keep this information or the facts from being believed by the public. So I think you, as a consumer of news, when you see that hallmark, you can just be aware that I always ask myself when I see it, why are they trying to stop what this person is saying rather than just debate it? Why do they want it censored? Why do they want it controversialized? And by being aware of it, I think that's the best we can do. And for me to call it out when I see it. Thank you.
Good afternoon, man. Cadet Holden, VMI. My question is, Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky wrote the book Manufacturing Consent in the 90s, discussing large media and such, and many of the similar tactics that you're now seeing today. And a big reason they pointed was the fact that media is now a profit-generating industry. Is there any real way to combat this? I mean, at this point, the media is more out for profit and more out for generating costs and everything and income than actual truth.
That's a great question. And I quoted some of Noam Chomsky's work in my last book. But I think we've gone into a new place. A lot of people argue, well, part of what we're seeing on the news now is because they have to make money. I'm going to tell you something you won't hear much, and I'm pretty sure this is true, having worked at so many national news organizations and still do. We have been so infiltrated by political and corporate interests that direct what we do. It's not about money. We are now doing things contrary to our financial interests. For example, I think there's a market for not telling things that are purely opinion-based. I think there's a market for reporting on pharmaceutical industry dangers, which you will never see on the news to any big degree anymore because they pay for all the advertising. Same with print outlets. So we're doing things contrary, though, sometimes to our own interests because we are so wrapped up in the people that want to control a narrative. There may be political interests controlling a story, keeping it off the news, that would actually serve our public and bring in ratings, but they're so driven to control a narrative for a political operation or a corporate interest that it's contrary to their own interests. Some people say there are some news organizations that are spiraling downward with lower numbers and lower ratings because of some of the things they're doing, but they're so wrapped up being controlled by factors and facets that want to control narratives that they're willing to sacrifice profits to make sure narratives are controlled.
What's kind of led to that, though? Like, it seems like a little...
What's the what?
What's like led to that change, though? I mean, it seems kind of ridiculous.
The slow infiltration, news has now merged together with the people that wanted to control what we say and do. So it used to be political and corporate interests approach us, they send us talking points, they try to put information on the table that we talk about, they get people talking on social media so the news covers certain things. Now we've hired them. They work in the news organizations. So their goal isn't to put out the fairest news possible. They don't care if they make a mistake. Their goal is to direct a narrative in a certain direction. Not all reporters are like that. I'm not saying that, but middle managers, bosses, some key editors, they're former political operatives who worked for a political party. They come into the news organization, their goal isn't the same as ours. Their goal is to keep something off the front pages. The New York Times knew about the FBI investigation into the Clinton Foundation, because I knew from a source there who told me they knew about it, weeks before it was reported during the campaign, but it was kept from being reported by the New York Times by an editor or a group of editors. So there are people in the chain that can keep information from becoming public because we've hired them in our newsrooms to do this.
Thank you, ma'am.
Good afternoon, man. Cadet Hillman, VMI. I was wondering how you felt about the fact that large corporations own a significant portion of media. Some figures rate it at 90% of the media. And if it's a problem, how do we combat that?
You may be talking about the same large corporations that own a few of the media. So there's not just large corporations owning media, but the same few.
Yes, ma'am.
And I think that is, I don't see that as the key problem, but that is an issue. That's something we've discussed a lot of in the past 10 or 15 years. My company, I left CBS, which was a big, large company that owns a lot, to work for, actually I left to work for nobody, and because I was just disgusted with the business, and I ended up going with an independent company called Sinclair, which is a conservative-run billionaires group of stations that offered me the only chance I was offered to do an independent show without political influence or corporate influence, which is kind of amazing. And Sinclair is now criticized by there's a smear campaign that Media Matters is helping with against Sinclair as a news organization because the top of the corporation is run by a conservative billionaire, and that family is. But as I argue, I worked at CBS for years, which was run by liberal billionaires, Les Moonves and Sumner Redstone. I worked for CNN, which was run by a liberal billionaire, Ted Turner. In all of those cases, I didn't see a lot of filter down. I didn't see those bosses at the top were directly dictating news coverage. My boss now is not dictating at all what I do on my program, but it's being attacked by the same people that never attacked when they were liberals, are attacking the conservative for obvious reasons. But I think there is a question of diversity, and do you really want giant corporations and the same giant corporations running a lot? And that can be an issue. I know ABC owns, I don't know if they still own Walt Disney World. I mean, there's famous stories about you cannot report on Disney there. If there were any exposés or any little stories to be done on that they would reach down from corporation and stop those stories. Every network probably has their own. CBS has their big scandal when they tried to report on the tobacco industry and cancer connections years ago when it wasn't well established, at least in the public. Those stories were stopped because the corporation's connections with tobacco advertisers. So yeah, I think that can always be an issue. I don't see that as the key issue dictating things right now.
What would you say the key issue is then?
I would say it's the industry that operates below the radar that most people don't have any idea of, that pulls strings, often using third parties, to make sure that the news is talking about the same 2 or 3 things all the time, what they want them to talk about, and carving out or censoring or keeping secret other stories that they don't want us talking about.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cadet Preston Duff, Virginia Military Institute. So in the 1800s, we had the industrial age. In the 1900s, we had the technological age, and many are saying that now we are moving into more of a trust age. And so with that affecting our economic policy, our political change, how do you think, basically as we're going into the emergency of blockchaining, which will then make unchangeable ledgers, following both the economic and the political policies, how that will change both the political and the news landscape, since they will not then be able to go back in and change that past.
What is blockchaining?
It's an unchangeable ledger which will follow basically economics. So if I were to buy something, it would basically keep a tab of where that money was transferred. So if I was to be saying I was an organic market, you could see that I was buying only organic goods, things like that. But also from a political stance, they're moving it in also to where they're thinking about using it for if they were voting on a particular policy, then other consumers would all have access to an open ledger, which would be able to see exactly the policies that they voted for.
You're saying this is technology that's...
It is, yes ma'am.
So it sounds similar to, I don't understand what you're talking about, you're talking way over my head, but it sounds similar to what kind of already exists. They call them big data companies, where I moderated a town hall during the 2016 campaign between the lead Democrat and the lead Republican in the big data industry, Karl Rove and Jim Messina. Karl Rove worked basically for Jeb Bush, and Jim Messina worked for Obama and Hillary Clinton. And they told the audience how we have, meaning they both together, at least 17 pieces of unique information on each one of you sitting here today. And he wasn't talking about, he said, like your license plate number and your, political affiliation. Yes, they have that. But they know that you on your upstairs TV, the wife is probably up there because she's watching this show, but in your basement, this show is on more often. They know what you bought at the store through your Super Saver card that you swipe through there to get your discount, and they're able to aggregate that with other bits of information that you have and inextricably tie you to all these bits of details, even the name of your pets. And they use that model to then market to you specifically. When you go online, you'll see, as you know, different ads, not just from what you clicked, but from this other information they have about you. You'll see a different ad than your husband will see, your wife will see, or your friends will see up the street. What's interesting about that, you didn't ask this part of the question, both those guys in front of me said Donald Trump would never win. They laughed, they literally mocked and laughed at Donald Trump, and I said he would win. And I think I only said he would win the whole time because I'm an outsider to this Washington establishment, even though I live there. And I think I could see things that they couldn't see. They thought their big data and all that money, I mean, Hillary Clinton far, far, far in Media Matters, and David Brock, who runs it, far outspent Donald Trump, far outspent Donald Trump. Totally controlled the media narrative to such a degree that nobody thought Trump was going to win, and he did. It's almost an indictment or almost a failure of this media machine that dictated the narrative and put in more money and yet couldn't win the race, which is an interesting twist at the end of the book. I was writing the book during all that happening. But I don't know if that gets at the heart of your
So you think
question.
basically how would news outlets transition into this age where everything would be openly accessible to everybody?
You mean the information they gather and the
Yes,
sources
ma'am.
that they use would be
Well, not necessarily the
transparent?
source, much more transparent, yes ma'am.
That sounds good if I'm understanding your question correctly. If there's a way for you to find out more about who's pulling the strings or who is giving information to the news organizations, and if you want to find out, and there's a place you could go to do that kind of research, I think that'd be great.
Yes,
Especially if the news organizations aren't disclosing themselves, which they often aren't now.
Right. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Hi
Hello
again. I was a cadet here 50 years ago. I'm kind of a slow learner. I don't know that people understand how courageous you are. Can you mention your lawsuit based on the hacking of your computer, probably by the previous administration?
Sure. So during, I guess this was 2014, as I was covering these stories, and there was a lot of effort to get me to stop the stories I was covering because they were perceived as damaging to very important people. An intelligence source, two of them in fact, came to me and said I was probably likely being monitored by the intel agencies surreptitiously via my computers and devices for the reporting that I was doing. This is before Edward Snowden. This is before we knew that the government was doing this to Associated Press and Fox News, so it sounded crazy. But through my sources, I was able to have an intel forensics expert look in my computer and confirm that someone using government proprietary software belonging to NSA, CIA, DIA, or FBI had been in my computer for quite some time, was monitoring my keystrokes, using Skype, you guys should know they can use Skype for this, to activate it silently and listen into your audio and exfiltrate files out of my computer, to hook into the CBS system to see what I was looking on, to look at my pictures. They planted classified documents in my computer. Long story short, I ultimately filed a lawsuit. I'm currently suing the Department of Justice, which the Trump administration continues to fight. This shows you how the bureaucracy stays the same no matter who's president. That's one thing I've learned. So they're still fighting as vigorously my lawsuit as they were when I started it about 3 years ago. And in the past week, we subpoenaed documents the judge allowed us from NSA, FBI, CIA, DIA, Department of Justice Inspector General, Verizon, CBS, Lockheed Martin, Booz Allen, and a number of others who are all connected to these surveillance systems that are politically used against people like me, and that case is ongoing.
Thank you. One other question. Your gun walking article. In March of 2009, I believe, there was a meeting in the White House. The President, Secretary of State, and the Attorney General. And they were mad because the previous attempt to get statistics on American weapons going south of the border, they, you know, it turned out to be Mexican, a lot of it Mexican troops selling their personal, their M16. So they said, we got to come up with a way to develop data that we can use for gun control. Well, then the Fast and Furious comes along. Is there any connection there?
I wrote a big article about that, that CBS, this was at the time when they were under pressure to quit covering this story, so I published it all online that they would publish, they wouldn't put on TV. And I wrote a big article about it. I think there was a component of the government was trying to use, so the government was secretly allowing weapons to go to Mexico. And there are emails that indicate they would then recover the weapons they sent without saying they sent them there and use it for evidence that look at all the weapons that are being trafficked to Mexico, we need better gun control laws. So they're basically seeding the argument up front without telling the public, and there's emails about that. I don't think, based on what I know, that was the whole impetus of the whole operation. We don't know because President Obama declared executive privilege and has kept documents secret to this day, but I believe there was an element of us, we were supporting one of the drug cartels against the Sinaloa cartel, against the Zeta drug cartel, which we've done in many countries. We've supported one side against the other, and I believe there was an element of some secret operations going on that were at the heart of that too.
Finally, just one, is there any hope for a curmudgeon like me that all this mess will get cleaned up and that the media will once again be trustworthy?
I hope the pendulum swings, as I say.
Thank you.
We'll have to see. Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon. He's one of my brother rats, John Metzger, class 71. And after that last segment, I had opportunity to speak with Seth. And my question to him was, those guys, since you've taken shots at them, I'm going to take a shot at them. They didn't seem to do much for the reputation and the perception of the media from the general public. Their approval rating is probably even lower than Congress's. And the issue is, and they kept promoting this journalism. I thought they were supposed to be reporters. And you know, when reporting turns into opinion pieces, that's, I think, where we get into a lot of problems. But you know, that's just my take on the situation and just my little comment. The other thing is this past week, was probably a huge, one of the biggest breaking news weeks that we've had in recent times. And I'd just like to get your comment probably on the ultimate fake news, which was the dossier.
I think there is a general acceptance now that the dossier that was presented apparently to the FBI and to the media, most of the media didn't publish it or bite on it, with information about Donald Trump that is probably untrue, it was just radically wild and unsubstantiated. That's a fascinating tale, especially now that we know there was an opposition research company behind it, that there could have been some Republican money behind it because Republicans didn't want Trump elected either, that there was Democrat money behind it as well. I haven't independently...
Even FBI money.
And even FBI money, so I haven't independently researched it, but I think that is, as you say, going to be a huge story, and I'm interested in learning more.
My last other question, I don't know if it was done overtly or by accident, but there's any reason when you named off all the news sources you forgot Fox?
In what respect?
Well, you named off all the news sources, and you wondered, I think, whether there was any credible ones left. And I submit to you that, considering that Fox News is not only the #1 news channel, it's the #1 cable channel in the universe, why you forgot to mention it?
I didn't. Did I name credible news organizations? I don't know an answer to which question. I wasn't trying to list credible and uncredible news organizations. Fox, I think, has good reporting, some excellent reporting. I also see some of the same issues there as I see it at other news outlets in terms of the narrative being dictated and my personal not to heap on Fox, but like other cable channels, they will have a Media Matters trained pundit on one side and a Republican on the other, both delivering talking points that don't illuminate much and not getting off their talking points and maybe aren't giving much truth. And then they call it fair because they had both sides, but I'm not learning anything. And I think that's pervasive on a lot of the 24-hour channels and cable channels as well. But I do agree that a lot of people get a lot of good information from Fox and that there are other choices out there too.
Well, at least they, like you say, they do have both sides, and it is rather comical. I mean, when Fox, for example, runs all the little clips of the talking points on like a gazillion channels.
Thank you for your questions and
comments. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Well, we're at the end of time, but I did want to offer Ms. Attkisson the opportunity, since she's the closing speaker, to comment on the theme, speaking truth to power, candid and courageous civil discourse, and maybe give us a few thoughts on how we might move to a more civil discourse.
Well, I would say that this will sound like, you know, everything is done by this industry that I write about, but I do think so much is. I don't think we're quite as divided as we're made out to be. And I think in some cases we're divided because there's this industry that's trying to divide us, and they're using social media and the news to do it. On my program last Sunday, I did a story about Gallup, just recently did a poll they've been doing for 10 years called Thriving, a world poll on how people see themselves. They ask them, do you see yourselves in 4 years in a better position? Rate yourselves, your outlook on a scale. Well, lo and behold, when we dug into the poll, Americans had reached a low right before the election. And since Donald Trump was elected, it's gone up hugely to 57. It was under, I think it was about 40 points, and now it's up to something like 57%. And I said to the Gallup pollster, certainly not a right-wing organization, I said, if you watch social media or look at the news, you're apt to think we've never been unhappier. Things have never been worse for us, between us. And I said, but your poll belies that. So I would just say, don't believe everything that you read and see on social media. I think a lot of the divisions that we talk about are stoked intentionally by people who will benefit, or their side will benefit from us being divided and fighting against ourselves. On my Twitter feed, if you follow me at Sharryl Attkisson, I engage all the time with people that don't agree with me. Some of them are trolls. I think they're paid. Some of them are just ordinary, genuine people who may disagree with who they think I am and what I do. But if they're civil, I keep talking to them. And I would just say, try to remain civil. And when you see the inflammatory language used, what I tell myself is, most Americans that I know, they want the same thing. They want a better life. They care about their family. They care about their friends. They care about their country. They just have disagreements on what that means and how to get there. But it's not that there's evil people against the good people. So I would just say keep that in mind and listen to the opposition with that in mind, and maybe we find more common ground even if we're not going to agree on everything.
Great thought. If you want to know more, the smear is available out in the Marshall lobby there, and Ms. Attkisson will be on hand right after this to sign your copy. I highly recommend it. So, Ms. Attkisson, on behalf of the superintendent, the faculty and staff, and the Corps cadets, we appreciate your great insights. You've concluded the conference extremely well. Please accept these small
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you, sir.